We like to believe Japan's history was built on honor, courage, and heroism. But one battle proves the opposite. A battle where honor saved no one, and where survival defeated morality. At Dan-no-ura, the heroic ideal died at sea. If you came from our video on the Genpei War, this is the chapter no one tells. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment what city you're watching from. Here on Fragments of History, history isn't romanticized. The samurai we imagine today never truly existed. The warrior chained to an unbreakable code, choosing death over disgrace, sacrificing everything for loyalty. That figure is a later invention. A beautiful lie shaped long after the last swords of the Genpei War were washed clean. The warriors of the 12th century would not recognize the noble archetype we praise. They would recognize power, they would recognize fear, they would recognize necessity. What we call samurai honor is often traced to Bushido, but that framework wasn't formalized until the Edo period, almost 400 years after the sea swallowed Dan-no-ura. By then, Japan had settled into peace. Samurai were no longer living as battlefield men. Many became administrators, their blades worn more as symbols than instruments. And in that quiet, scholars and former warriors began to rewrite the memory of violence into something palatable, a disciplined tradition, guided by virtue, purified by restraint. Much of the modern image was shaped by later texts, including works like the Hagakure in the early 1700s. These writings speak of loyalty, self-sacrifice, and moral purity as the spine of warrior life. But they are not field reports. They are not the testimony of men surrounded by arrows, fire, and drowning. They are an afterimage, a story told from safety about what war should have been, not what it was. In the 12th century, the rules were older and simpler. Survive, advance, secure your line. Honor existed, but it was not a sacred absolute. It shifted with circumstance, status, and opportunity. Reputation mattered, but reputation was tied to outcomes. A warrior who won battles, took land, and strengthened his house was praised regardless of how he achieved it. Virtue was admired when convenient. Effectiveness was respected always. This is the part modern audiences resist. Medieval warfare in Japan was pragmatic to the point of cruelty. Betrayal wasn't rare, it was strategic. Allegiances could change in the middle of a campaign, sometimes in the middle of a fight when advantage tilted elsewhere. Ambushes, night raids, and sudden attacks were not shameful exceptions. They were tools. The objective was not to die beautifully. The objective was to live and leave your enemies unable to recover. The samurai of the Genpei War were not romantic heroes. They were professionals moving through a collapsing order, serving leaders who demanded results. A lord rewarded victory, not purity. And when a warrior shifted sides, it wasn't automatically seen as a spiritual failure. Often it was read as a calculation. Which banner ensures my family's survival, my children's security, my name's continuation? Violence wasn't ritualized, it wasn't clean, it didn't pause for speeches. Villages burned, prisoners were executed. Enemy families were targeted to erase future retaliation. These acts weren't viewed as betrayals of warrior culture, they were part of its logic. The battlefield didn't reward hesitation. It rewarded certainty, speed, and the willingness to do what the other man couldn't. Even personal combat, when it happened, was rarely the elegant duel later art would sell as truth. The famous image, two warriors declaring lineage before a formal clash, belongs more to literature than to the chaos of real fighting. In war, men looked for numbers, positioning, surprise, and momentum. Glory was welcome. Survival was essential. So why does the myth persist? Because it comforts. It transforms brutal contests for power into stories of noble sacrifice. It gives meaning to suffering and order to bloodshed. And it becomes useful, especially to later governments and elites who need the past to justify authority in the present. A warrior class becomes easier to admire when it can be framed as moral. A violent history becomes easier to inherit when it can be cleaned. But Dan-no-ura cannot be understood through that myth. The men who fought there were not bound by an ethic that hadn't been written yet. They were exhausted, desperate, and cornered by years of war. Their choices were shaped by current, tide, fear, and calculation, not philosophical ideals invented by descendants trying to make sense of ruin. The real samurai was adaptable, pragmatic, often ruthless. He valued his life, his family's future, and the reputation that kept both intact. Honor existed, but as a tool, a language of status, a mask that could be worn or removed depending on what survival demanded. When circumstances tightened, honor bent. When survival required betrayal, loyalty cracked. Dan-no-ura would expose that truth without mercy. And when the final test arrived, when the sea became a battlefield and the fate of a child emperor hung in the balance, the warriors of Japan would not choose the story we were taught to expect. They would choose what war always demands, and the cost would be permanent. By 1185, Japan had been tearing itself apart for 5 years. The Genpei War was not a chain of isolated battles, it was a slow national hemorrhage that reached into every province, every village, every household. What began as a struggle between the Taira and Minamoto had swollen into something larger than ambition. It became a crisis of endurance, a test of whether the country could survive its own collapse. Japan was exhausted in every sense. Economically, the imperial tax system was no longer functioning as a system at all. Rice paddies lay untended as farmers were conscripted, killed, or forced to run ahead of marching armies. Trade routes that once stitched the islands together became corridors of risk where movement meant exposure. Roads, bridges, and ports deteriorated, not from neglect alone, but from a brutal reallocation of labor and resources toward war. Wealth built over generations did not vanish in a single moment. It bled out, season by season. The great clans suffered the same slow ruin. Houses that could field thousands at the war's opening now struggled to gather hundreds. Bloodlines with centuries behind them ended in single afternoons. The aristocratic families that once governed provinces through rank and ceremony found their authority thinning under military necessity. In the spaces where tradition had once held, force filled in. And the casualties did not belong only to warriors. Every engagement sent civilians spilling across the landscape. Villages burned, sometimes as strategy, sometimes as warning, sometimes simply because an army needed food and left nothing behind. Refugees flooded into towns that could not feed the mouths already there. Disease followed the movement of men and supplies, spreading through crowded settlements where malnutrition had already weakened the body's defenses. The war turned ordinary life into displacement, then into scarcity, then into death. The damage was not incidental, it was structural. In that environment, loyalty became both priceless and unstable. Warriors who had sworn eternal allegiance found those oaths tested by hunger, defeat, and the survival of their children. The bonds between lord and retainer frayed under pressure, not because men became suddenly faithless, but because the world around them no longer supported ceremony. A samurai watching his family starve while his lord stumbled from loss to loss did not face a moral dilemma. He faced a question of extinction. Honor cannot feed anyone. Regional powers began to reassess with cold attention. Provinces that had sent men to the Taira cause held back reinforcements, waiting for clearer signs. Clans aligned with the Minamoto opened quiet channels elsewhere, preserving options. No one needed speeches to understand the rule of the late war. Back the losing side, and you do not survive to regret it. The conflict gained a momentum no leader could fully control. What began over influence at court expanded into a struggle over the country's political future. But after 5 years, the original justifications mattered less than the consequences of stopping. To pause meant to admit weakness. To admit weakness meant to invite slaughter. Both sides kept fighting because defeat was not a change in status, it was annihilation. The stalemate consumed everything it touched. Famine spread across the archipelago. Agricultural production collapsed in the regions most contested. Fields that should have been planted were trampled and abandoned. Livestock disappeared into passing supply trains, leaving farmers without the means to plow or transport. Fishing villages were raided for provisions. Boats were pressed into service. Networks that had quietly sustained Japan for centuries, storage, distribution, seasonal movement, broke down. Hunger became a constant presence, not a disaster that arrived, but a condition that settled. In cities, order thinned to a fragile surface. Criminal groups flourished in the gaps where authority no longer reached. Neighborhoods fell under informal control, protection demanded from people who had no one else to appeal to. Temples and religious institutions, once anchors of stability, began militarizing for defense. The lines between soldier, bandit, and civilian blurred until they were no longer lines at all. The imperial court in Kyoto continued, but it no longer governed. Its decrees were symbols without enforcement, words that could not stop armies. The emperor himself was a child, moved and controlled by whichever faction held him. Ceremonies persisted in a strange pantomime of normalcy while the country burned, as if ritual could hold reality in place. Ancient institutions revealed their limits in full view and in full failure. Both Taira and Minamoto leadership understood a truth that could no longer be avoided. This war could not continue forever. Resources were finite, and the reserves were being consumed. Warriors were exhausted. Years of campaigning dulled their edge and thinned their ranks. Supply lines stretched and snapped. Every leader could feel the same pressure, not simply to win, but to end it before there was nothing left worth ruling. Strategy shifted toward conclusion. Not another series of skirmishes, not another regional engagement, a decisive confrontation. The question was no longer if it would happen, but where and when. Geography would decide the stage, logistics would decide the timing, desperation would decide the rest. The Taira, despite setbacks, still held a crucial advantage: the sea. Their naval strength and familiarity with maritime warfare gave them a domain where Minamoto land dominance weakened. The inland sea offered mobility, protection, and distance. It also held the war's most dangerous symbol. The child emperor Antoku, barely 7 years old, kept aboard their ships as both icon and leverage. For the Minamoto, the situation was just as desperate. They controlled much of the eastern provinces and had won major engagements, but victory remained incomplete while the Taira fleet endured and the emperor remained out of reach. Each day the war dragged on benefited no one. Resources dwindled, alliances softened, the risk of total societal collapse grew heavier, so the convergence tightened like a noose. Strategy and geography pressed both factions toward the narrow straits of Dan-no-ura, where the inland sea constricted into a natural killing ground. The currents there were treacherous, shifting with the hour. The water was unpredictable. The conditions were perfect for a battle that could end the war in a single day. And neither side fully understood what that meeting would destroy. Not just armies, not just clans. Something deeper, something Japan would spend generations trying to cover with the language of honor. The Taira did not choose the sea because they were winning. They chose it because land was closing around them. After losing the capital and watching their power onshore fracture, the ocean became their last remaining domain. Not a sanctuary, but a final angle of resistance. They called it strategy because admitting desperation would have meant admitting the end. What they were really doing was wagering everything on the one place they still understood better than their enemies, hoping mastery could compensate for collapse. Naval warfare in 12th century Japan was not simply land combat transplanted onto water. Ships were movement and fortification at once, floating platforms for archery, crowded spaces for boarding, unstable ground where balance and timing decided who lived. The Taira had spent generations inside that reality. Their warriors had been raised around boats, trained to read wave rhythm, to adjust arrow fire to wind and spray, to board in rough water without hesitation. This knowledge wasn't academic, it was lived. The inland sea between Honshu and Kyushu belonged to them in every practical sense. They knew the currents, the tides, the seasonal shifts in wind. It wasn't information stored in scrolls. It was memory carried by sailors and captains who had navigated those waters since childhood. The straits at Dan-no-ura were especially dangerous. Currents there changed direction more than once a day, with tidal flow. A ship caught at the wrong moment could become helpless, spun into the wrong line, turned into a target that could not correct itself. The Taira believed this place would magnify their advantage until it became untouchable. For centuries, they had controlled maritime routes linking the islands. They taxed merchant traffic, maintained ports, regulated movement. That economic reach translated directly into naval capability. Their fleet wasn't improvised in panic. It was the product of long infrastructure, vessels kept in working condition, crews with experience, systems for supply and coordination. On paper, the Minamoto had no equal answer for that, but the fleet was never only military. It was also political theatre. By keeping the imperial presence mobile at sea, the Taira performed legitimacy even as their landholdings shrank. A powerful fleet suggested stability. A court aboard ships suggested continuity. To wavering allies, it was meant to look like control rather than retreat, like command rather than flight. Their naval strength was a weapon, but also a message. We still hold the center of Japan, even if the ground beneath it has moved. At the core of that message was Emperor Antoku, a child, 7 years old, carried through a war he never chose. The Taira had shaped succession and placed him on the throne when he was barely 3. Now, years later, he had become their last claim to rightful rule. Whoever held the emperor held the symbol of authority. The Taira kept him aboard their flagship, wrapped in layers of protection, and convinced themselves that his presence made the fleet untouchable, not through strength, but through necessity. Their calculation was simple. The Minamoto would not risk killing the emperor. That belief wasn't just hope, it was strategy. If the Minamoto hesitated, if they fought with restraint, the Taira could press harder. The child became more than a symbol. He became leverage, a living constraint on enemy action, a human shield dressed in imperial meaning. The Taira assumed this would tilt every exchange, especially at sea, where a moment's pause could become a death sentence. This was what desperation does. It sharpens logic until it becomes brittle. On land, the Taira had lost almost everything. Kyoto was gone. Provincial holdings were being stripped away. Allies defected, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. The only arena where their superiority still felt absolute was the sea. So the sea became their last stand, the decision of a clan with no other decisions left. Retreat promised slow annihilation. Battle offered the smallest possibility of reversal, and they seized it because even a slim chance felt better than waiting to die. The Minamoto were trapped by their own necessity. They could not claim victory while the Taira fleet remained intact and the emperor remained in enemy hands. Every day the war continued, weakened them, drained resources, and left room for the situation to shift. They needed a decisive end, but naval combat was not their strength. Their advantage was land warfare, cavalry, familiar ground. None of that mattered on rolling decks where footing betrayed even the strongest fighter. Still, they had no choice but to meet the Taira on terms that favored the Taira, so both sides were pulled toward Dan-no-ura. The straits formed a natural choke point. The confined water limited retreat and compressed movement into predictable lanes. It prevented the Taira from simply vanishing into open sea, while also ensuring that Minamoto numbers and pressure could be brought into contact. It was the kind of place strategists recognize immediately, a narrow throat where a war could be forced into a single outcome. What neither side fully respected was how that same geography could turn certainty into catastrophe. In such confined waters, small decisions became irreversible. A slight misreading of tide, a ship drifting half a length out of position, an opening created and then swallowed, within minutes, advantage could harden into collapse. The currents the Taira knew so well were still alive, still volatile, still capable of shifting with weather and variation that experience could not fully command. And once the battle began, retreat would be more theory than option. The Taira's greatest miscalculation wasn't tactical, it was psychological. They assumed their enemies would value the emperor's life above victory. They believed the sanctity of imperial authority would bind Minamoto hands, forcing hesitation at the critical moment. It felt unquestionable, something as stable as tradition, as reliable as the tides they had studied all their lives. They were wrong. The Minamoto were desperate enough to risk everything, even the emperor's life. And worse, the Taira could no longer assume unwavering loyalty among their own. The last years had already proven that tradition fractures under hunger, fear, and the instinct to survive. Men trapped on ships in a losing battle do not think in terms of precedent. They think in terms of breath. The Taira believed they had built an unassailable position, waters they knew intimately, a fleet shaped by generations, a child emperor turned into protection. What they had actually built was a trap, and soon they would feel it close. The fleets converged at Dan-no-ura on the morning of April 25, 1185, a spectacle that might have looked magnificent from a distance if it hadn't been so final. Hundreds of vessels pressed into the narrow straits, banners snapping above decks crowded with men who understood what the water would demand from them. The currents began their slow, inevitable shift, and both sides entered with the same private knowledge. There would be no draw here, no clean retreat, no mercy waiting on the far shore. Whatever survived this day would rule what remained. Naval combat in this period did not unfold like the ordered warfare later generations would imagine. There were no stable lines, no elegant formations once contact was made. The battle began as a collision of moving wood and moving bodies, ships converging into a violent mass, captains making decisions by instinct and proximity. Strategies discussed in council became paper the moment the first arrows flew. Command dissolved quickly into fragments, a dozen fights, 100 fights, each one blind to the next. Archers formed the first wave, trying to break crews before boarding began. But archery from a stable platform is difficult. From a rolling deck surrounded by spray, it bordered on chance. Men trained for years to strike targets on solid ground found their footing slipping beneath them, their aim betrayed by wind and pitch. Arrows that would have killed cleanly on land sailed wide or sank uselessly into the water. The shots that landed felt less like mastery than luck arriving at the right moment. The sea undermined everything these warriors had been taught to rely on. Balance became a constant battle. Armor that protected on land turned heavy and unforgiving at sea, weight that threatened to pull a man under if he slipped overboard. Weapons that felt precise on firm ground became awkward on shifting planks. Training mattered, but the environment had its own authority, and it did not negotiate. As the fleets closed, the battle shed any remaining shape and became something raw. Ships struck and locked, hulls grinding together as warriors surged forward to board. Combat erupted in dozens of separate collisions at once, not one battlefield, but many, all packed into the same choking stretch of water. Swords, spears, and daggers replaced arrows. Blood slicked the decks, bodies toppled into the gap between vessels and vanished beneath the churn in seconds. There were no pauses, no clear turns, only the constant pressure of men trying to force other men into the sea. Sound became oppressive. Metal rang against metal. Wood cracked under strain. Wounded men screamed and were drowned out by fresh shouting. Orders were shouted into smoke and wind and disappeared unanswered. Signal fires and burning vessels darkened the air, blurring distances, turning the straits into a shifting wall of haze where enemies appeared suddenly and close. Warriors struck faces they couldn't name, killed men they couldn't identify, and moved on because stopping meant dying. The clean distinctions of rank and clan dissolved into the simplest categories: threat, opening, survival. No code governed what was happening now. The formalities later stories loved: lineage announced before combat, reputations declared like ceremony, were impossible here, almost obscene. Men stabbed from behind. Crews swarmed isolated opponents. Wounded fighters were shoved into the water because dragging them aside was a luxury no one could afford. Whatever peacetime ideals existed in memory vanished as soon as the sea began taking bodies. And the sea took many. The tides that the Taira had trusted began to show their true nature. As morning slipped toward afternoon, the current reversed. Not gently, but with a force that altered everything. Ships that had been advancing found themselves shoved back. Vessels that held strong positions were suddenly dragged into disadvantage. The Taira knew these waters, but knowledge could not tame them. Nature did not fight for either side. The sea was not an ally. It was a second enemy. Both armies discovered almost at once that command could not hold. Generals could not see the whole field through smoke and collisions. Messages could not move reliably across the water. Control narrowed to the size of a deck. Captains became generals of their own small worlds, making decisions based on the nearest threat, the nearest opening, the moment-to-moment shift of tide. The War Council's careful certainty had no place here. Each ship was an isolated war, and each war was decided by endurance, numbers, skill, and the brutal randomness of the straits. Men raised on stories of individual glory found themselves fighting where glory could not exist. There were no witnesses to preserve heroic last stands, no stable ground for poets to point to later. Bodies slipped beneath the surface and took their names with them. In the smoke and confusion, even victory was hard to recognize. Reputation, that currency the warrior world claimed to live by, became meaningless when no one could see what you did, and no one might live long enough to tell it. The Taira's early confidence began to erode as the first hour stretched into more. Their maritime experience gave them advantages, but not the overwhelming dominance they had expected. The Minamoto, though less practiced at sea, compensated with numbers and desperation. For every Taira ship that held, another was pressed by multiple enemies at once. The battle refused to follow anyone's plan, because nothing in this chaos could remain planned for long. By early afternoon, exhaustion became its own weapon. Men who had fought for hours could barely lift their arms. The adrenaline that had carried them through the first collisions drained away, leaving only muscle failure and salt-stung eyes. Warriors stumbled not from wounds, but from collapse, slipping on blood-dark planks, dropping weapons they could no longer grip. The battle entered a phase where endurance mattered more than bravery, and endurance was running out for everyone. Neither side could have predicted how completely the fight would escape their control. What was meant to be a decisive naval engagement had become something older and more primitive, a grinding slaughter inside a narrow pen of water where retreat was nearly impossible and victory still unclear. And then a decision was made that would tilt the entire war. Not by a general, not by a lord, by someone no one had counted as dangerous. Taguchi Shigeyoshi was not a great name within the Taira. He commanded only a small contingent of ships, held no celebrated title, carried no real political weight. He was the kind of figure history usually swallows without leaving a trace, and he would have vanished the same way if not for what he chose to do in the middle of Dan-no-ura. In a single act of calculated treachery, A minor commander altered the fate of Japan more decisively than any battlefield genius could have through force alone. It happened without warning. In the midst of the grinding chaos, Taguchi's ships pulled away from their positions and raised Minamoto banners. Men who had been fighting under Taira colors moments before turned their blades on the ships beside them. The switch was so sudden, so complete, that some Taira warriors didn't even understand what they were seeing until it was too late. They died, confused, cut down by men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with them that same morning. But Taguchi didn't merely change sides. He brought something with him that turned betrayal into devastation. He revealed the location of the imperial flagship carrying Emperor Antoku. The Taira had guarded that secret carefully, shifting the emperor between vessels to prevent direct targeting. In the smoke and collisions, identification was already difficult, and the Taira depended on that uncertainty. Taguchi ended it. He knew the movements, he knew the signs, and he handed the Minamoto the only information that mattered: which ship held the most valuable body in Japan. The effect was immediate. The battle's violence had been scattered across dozens of collisions, a struggle of endurance and chance. Now it snapped into focus. Minamoto forces suddenly had a single objective. Through chaos that had swallowed orders all day, this message moved with brutal clarity. Find the Emperor's ship, overwhelm it, take the child. Random fighting became directed pressure. Disorder turned into purpose. The Minamoto had been fighting to survive. Now they were fighting to end the war. For the Taira, the psychological impact landed harder than any arrow. Their entire strategy depended on an assumption that the Emperor's presence would restrain their enemies. That imperial sanctity would create hesitation. That tradition would hold even in blood and spray. Taguchi's betrayal shattered that belief in an instant. The Minamoto were not hesitating. They were driving toward the flagship, willing to risk the Emperor's life for decisive victory. Every calculation the Taira leadership had made was suddenly, terrifyingly wrong. And the betrayal exposed something even worse. If Taguchi could switch sides in the middle of battle, who else might? How many commanders were making their own silent calculations, weighing the clan's fading prospects against their family's survival? The betrayal planted suspicion like poison. Warriors began glancing sideways at the men beside them, wondering if the next blade would come from an enemy ship or from their own line. Trust, already eroded by years of war, evaporated within minutes. The tactical situation collapsed with frightening speed. Ships guarding the imperial center found themselves targeted by overwhelming force. The Minamoto concentrated their strength on a single prize, accepting losses elsewhere to secure the emperor. Taguchi's men, now fighting for the Minamoto, understood Taira patterns and weak points and exploited them without mercy. What had been a chaotic stalemate hardened into a focused assault the Taira could not absorb. Demoralization spread through the Taira fleet like fire through dry timber. Warriors who had fought with desperate courage for hours began asking a quieter, deadlier question. Why are we still fighting? Naval skill had not delivered safety. Knowledge of the waters had not prevented disaster. Possession of the emperor had not restrained the enemy. Every advantage they believed in was dissolving in front of them. Some commanders tried to rally their forces, shouting orders, invoking clan loyalty, but their voices were swallowed by a larger truth. They were losing, and everyone could see it. Men who might have died gladly in a battle that still felt winnable began searching for ways to survive a battle that was not. Ships that had held formation started drifting apart as captains made private decisions. Cohesion, the spine of any fleet, began to break, and the old language of honor proved weightless. Oaths that sounded eternal on land became fragile on water. Some tried to surrender, though mercy was scarce in these straits. Others threw weapons aside and dove into the sea, choosing the uncertain gamble of drowning over the certainty of steel. Dan-no-ura was stripping warfare down to its oldest truth. When death becomes immediate, survival rises above every principle men claim to live by. The Minamoto sensed the shift and pressed harder. Exhaustion that had nearly broken them minutes before was replaced by the fierce energy of approaching victory. Ships that had fought cautiously became aggressive, boarding with renewed brutality. Momentum, that invisible force armies can feel before they can explain, had turned completely. The Taira were no longer simply losing. They were beginning to rout, their fleet fragmenting inside a narrow stretch of water where escape was more fantasy than route. On the Imperial flagship, Taira commanders faced their final, unbearable arithmetic. They had brought the Emperor to battle, believing his presence guaranteed protection. Instead, they had trapped him in a floating prison, surrounded by enemies willing to gamble his life for the end of the war. The child who was supposed to shield them had become their greatest liability, and with every passing moment, the possibility of capture grew. The Emperor, taken alive, paraded as a trophy, used to legitimize Minamoto rule. For some, death began to look cleaner than that. Taguchi's betrayal did not just shift tactics. It destroyed the foundations the Taira had built their resistance on: naval superiority, the restraining power of imperial authority, the loyalty of their own men. It proved that every supposed rule of war was conditional, fragile, and that under enough pressure, tradition becomes nothing more than a story people stop obeying. Victory was not fully secured yet, but it was visible. The Minamoto could see the path to it, and so could the Taira, and that recognition, more than any blade, was what finally broke them. What came next would not be remembered as a military outcome, it would be remembered as a wound. Emperor Antoku was 7 years old when he drowned in the Shimonoseki Strait. He had worn the title of emperor since he was 3, a crown that meant nothing to him except that it made him valuable to adults with their own ambitions. He didn't choose this role. He didn't understand the political machinery that made his body a prize. He didn't ask to be placed aboard a warship in the middle of a losing battle. His short life had been spent as an object passed between hands that called themselves loyal. In his final minutes, he was still what he had always been, a child caught inside a world that never made room for him. The Imperial flagship was closing in on its end. Minamoto warriors boarded from multiple directions, pouring over the sides, driving forward through exhausted defenders. The sounds of combat tightened around the Emperor like a net. Steel striking steel, men shouting into smoke, the sudden screams of those who fell, footsteps hammered across planks darkened by blood and seawater. The ship felt smaller with every second, as if the walls were moving inward. Antoku sat in ceremonial robes meant for court, not war, elaborate, heavy, and painfully out of place. He watched the adults around him fracture into panic. He may not have understood the tactics, the banners, the names being shouted across the deck, but he understood fear when he saw it on faces that had always pretended to be calm. Ni no Ama, his grandmother, made the decision. She was in her late 50s, hardened by decades of court politics. She understood exactly what capture would mean for her grandson. The Minamoto would display him, use him as proof of legitimacy, and discard him when he no longer served their purpose. She had seen what political executions looked like when they wore polite disguises. In her mind, death in the water was cleaner than the slow erasure that would follow captivity. So she gathered what could still be gathered. She took the sacred sword, Kusanagi, one of the imperial regalia that symbolized the emperor's right to rule. She took the sacred jewel. Then she took the child's hand. Later chronicles claim she told him they were going to a better place, a palace beneath the waves where he would be safe. Whether she believed it, or whether it was simply the only comfort she could offer a terrified child at the edge of death, no one can know. What is certain is that she held him tightly and stepped off the ship into the churning waters. Antoku drowned almost immediately. The weight of his soaked robes dragged him down before he could even struggle. His body disappeared beneath the surface within seconds. With him went the regalia in no-ama's arms, symbols that had stood for centuries of authority, now sinking into black water like stones. No-ama followed him into the depths, choosing death over witnessing the collapse of everything she had helped uphold. Around them, other members of the Taira nobility made the same choice, leaping into the sea rather than facing capture, humiliation, and whatever came after. The act was devastating in a way that exceeded the battlefield. This was not only the death of a child, or even of an emperor, it was the drowning of an idea, the belief that imperial authority was untouchable, protected by tradition, ceremony, and sacred distance. The emperor, the theoretical center of legitimacy, had been carried into the ocean like unwanted cargo. The regalia that was supposed to remain bound to imperial possession was now somewhere below the surface. What was meant to be permanent proved just as fragile as wood and flesh. For the warriors who witnessed it, the impact was jagged and immediate. Taira fighters saw their cause sink in front of them. They had bled to protect the emperor, and he died anyway. Not at an enemy's hand, but by a decision made from within their own circle. The betrayal they felt was not toward the Minamoto alone. It reached deeper, toward the entire system that had demanded sacrifice under the promise of something sacred. Everything they had been told about duty and loyalty and inviolable authority ended in a child disappearing into water he could not escape. The Minamoto achieved the strategic outcome they needed. The Taira's claim to legitimacy was gone, but the manner of it left a silence that no victory chant could fill. The emperor was not supposed to die like this. In truth, he was not supposed to die at all. The unspoken rules everyone pretended still governed war had been shredded so completely that triumph felt contaminated. They had driven toward the emperor to secure him, not to drown him, but the result was the same. The center had fallen into the sea. The shock did not end with those who stood on the decks. As news spread through the fleet and then across Japan, it carried something colder than grief. The emperor had always been treated as inviolable, insulated by ritual and assumed sanctity. His death revealed how thin that insulation was. If the emperor could be killed, if he could be taken by his own supporters to prevent capture, then nothing was truly protected. Every ceremony, every oath, every appeal to divine authority was theater that dissolved when pressure became unbearable. This was the moment the language of heroic sacrifice began to collapse. Later stories would frame no-ama's choice as noble, death over dishonor. But there was nothing clean about drowning a frightened child. Many who followed overboard were not choosing martyrdom for a cause. They were fleeing consequences. Those still fighting were not acting out an ideal. They were trapped on breaking ships with nowhere to go. Strip away the romantic vocabulary, and Dan-no-ura exposes the raw material underneath. Murder and suicide as final acts of desperation by people who had run out of options. Japan would spend centuries trying to reshape what happened. Poets would soften it. Artists would turn terror into tragedy and tragedy into beauty. The machinery of memory would work relentlessly to make the scene bearable, to give it meaning, to turn horror into a lesson. But the people who were there carried something simpler and heavier. They watched a child drown because the adults around him had failed him completely. The regalia did not return cleanly to history. The sword was said to wash ashore later, though whether it was the sacred blade or a replacement was impossible to prove. The jewel was allegedly retrieved by divers, again without certainty. The mirror, the third piece, had not been aboard the ship. New emperors would be crowned with regalia that might be authentic or might be substitutes, and the country would proceed as if ambiguity could be sealed shut by ritual. That uncertainty was its own confession. Even the most sacred symbols could become negotiable when survival demanded it. What died at Dan-no-ura was not only a child emperor and not only a defeated clan. Something larger slipped beneath the surface with him. Something Japan would spend generations trying to name without admitting what it truly meant. and the sea kept it. The battle did not end with dramatic final stands or heroic last words. It ended with exhaustion, drowning, and the blunt recognition that fighting longer would change nothing. Surviving Taira warriors surrendered, fled, or died trying to force their way through waters they had once called their own. The Minamoto had won, but even to the victors, the outcome tasted strange. Something had broken in those straits, and everyone who stood on those decks felt it, even if none of them had words for it yet. The first thing to die was the idea of heroic warfare. For generations, Japanese military culture carried a mythology of individual combat, warriors meeting as equals, testing skill and courage in a kind of violent clarity. Dan-no-ura exposed that image as a story told from a safe distance. The reality was chaotic, anonymous, and governed by conditions no man could control: tide, smoke, footing, numbers, luck. Most of the dead never knew who struck them. Most of the living could not name a single opponent they had defeated. There was no clean glory in this kind of slaughter, only survival, only disappearance. The belief that wars could be conducted by honorable principles disintegrated alongside the Taira fleet. Taguchi's betrayal was not an aberration. It was a concentrated expression of what 5 years of war had already been teaching Japan. When survival is at stake, principles become negotiable. When annihilation becomes possible, loyalty becomes conditional. When victory demands ruthlessness, honor stops being virtue and becomes liability. Dan-no-ura did not invent these truths. It made them impossible to deny. And in the vacuum where honor had supposedly stood, something else rose: cunning, pragmatism, calculation. Taguchi, the man who changed sides mid-battle, was not executed as a traitor. He was rewarded. The Minamoto understood what his decision represented. Abandoning a losing cause had been worth more than the loyalty of 1,000 men who died faithfully. The message traveled quickly across Japan because it was clear and brutal. Results mattered more than principles. Winners would be celebrated regardless of method. Losers would be condemned regardless of sacrifice. This did not create a new morality. It revealed the one that had been there all along. After Dan-no-ura, the old pretense that dying honorably was preferable to living with shame became harder to maintain. The drowning of a child emperor, the collapse of an entire clan, the failure of every guarantee the Taira believed in. It stripped the language of noble death down to bone. Survival was no longer merely preferable. It was the only rational priority. A dead warrior protects nothing. A dead warrior leaves no lineage. Honor is a luxury the drowned cannot spend. War itself changed shape in the mind of Japan. The Genpei War proved that conflict would not be resolved through limited engagements or contained violence between elite fighters. War could engulf provinces, starve civilians, break economies, and continue until one side achieved total victory or total erasure. The romantic image of warfare as ritualized struggle evaporated. What remained was organized brutality that consumed everything around it, until the country itself began to thin. And out of that understanding, a different warrior became more visible: the pragmatic samurai. Not a figure bound by inflexible codes, but one who understood how fragile codes become under pressure. Loyalty lasted as long as it served both parties. Advantage mattered more than reputation. Adaptability outweighed tradition. This warrior would shape Japan's military reality for centuries, even as later generations tried to bury him under cleaner stories. Dan-no-ura also introduced a new kind of victory: victory without glory. The Minamoto eliminated their chief rivals and secured control, but there was no triumph that felt uncomplicated, no celebration that did not carry undertones of discomfort. They had benefited from betrayal. They had driven toward a child emperor and watched him vanish beneath the water. They had won through attrition, pressure, and ruthless focus, not through moral superiority or divine favor. Success felt less like righteousness than like being the side that endured. The psychological cost of that reality was immense, and mostly unspoken. Warriors raised inside clear moral frameworks saw those frameworks collapse under real conditions. The stories they had been fed about loyalty, honor, and heroic sacrifice proved unreliable when tested against blood and tide. The culture did not resolve the contradiction, it absorbed it. And instead of admitting the ideal was myth, Japan would later build even stronger myths, more elaborate and polished, to cover what Dan-no-ura had revealed. The gap between narrative and reality widened with every generation. Survivors carried what their society had no language to name. They had watched friends die meaninglessly. They had killed men who might have been allies if banners had shifted earlier. They had seen a child drown because the adults around him ran out of options and called it duty. They had learned that everything they believed about war was conditional and that knowledge could not be unlearned. But it also could not be spoken aloud without threatening the social order built on those beliefs. So a split became permanent. There was the official narrative, honor, loyalty, heroic sacrifice, the version taught forward as tradition. And then there was the practice of warfare, pragmatic, brutal, and stripped of sentiment, the version learned through experience. Everyone understood both existed, but only one could be openly praised without tearing the structure apart. Dan-no-ura was the moment that division became undeniable. For individual warriors, the lesson was simple and devastating. The system would sacrifice them without hesitation when circumstances demanded it. The emperor, supposedly sacred and inviolable, had been carried into the sea by his own protectors. If imperial authority could be discarded so completely, what chance did ordinary men have? Their lives, their service, their loyalty, all of it was a resource to be spent and thrown away, as strategy required. That realization broke the last illusions about their value beyond utility. And the Minamoto victory left a template behind. Military power, not imperial authority, would decide who ruled. The emperor would remain, but as symbol, a tool to legitimize whichever strong hand controlled force. That arrangement did not emerge from theory. It emerged from the hard lesson Dan-no-ura delivered. Real power belonged to those willing to use violence effectively, not those who appealed to tradition as protection. Japan would spend centuries trying to forget what Dan-no-ura taught. But forgetting is not the same as undoing. And the country that came after would be built on what sank that day, whether it admitted it or not. Minamoto no Yoritomo moved quickly to lock his victory into permanence. Within months of Dan-no-ura, consolidation began, systematic, unsentimental, and aimed at removing anyone who could become a rival. Even those closest to him were not safe. His brother Yoshitsune, celebrated for his command and praised as a military genius, was forced into exile and eventually hunted down. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty mattered less than potential threat. A new order was being built, and it would not be built on gratitude. What emerged from that consolidation was not merely a change of rulers, but a restructuring of how Japan would be governed. For centuries, the emperor had remained the theoretical center of authority, while power was exercised in his name by competing clans. Yoritomo made the underlying reality explicit. He created a parallel structure that openly acknowledged military force as the basis of rule. The emperor would remain in Kyoto, performing ceremony and providing legitimacy. Real power would shift to Kamakura, to the shogun, and to the network of warriors who enforced his will. This was Dan-no-ura, turned into policy. The new arrangement institutionalized the violence the war had exposed. The shogunate was not founded on divine right or courtly pedigree in the old sense. It was founded on the proven ability to destroy challengers. Military power became the acknowledged foundation of authority, with less need for comforting pretense. The system's logic was brutally simple: comply or be removed. And that clarity, in its own cold way, created stability, because everyone understood the rules, and everyone understood the price of breaking them. Violence became systematized. Formal mechanisms existed for settling disputes, but they rested on the credible threat of overwhelming force. Arguments between clans were not resolved by justice or tradition so much as by calculation. Who could enforce their outcome, and who could not? Law became inseparable from power. The shogun's authority was not philosophical, it was practical, backed by men who knew their own survival depended on maintaining the structure that kept them fed, armed, and protected. And yet, even as Japan embraced this pragmatic reality in practice, it began building a story to hide it. The process began almost immediately. Chronicles written later started reshaping memory, turning desperate decisions into noble gestures. Ni no Ama's choice with the child emperor became a protective sacrifice. Taguchi's betrayal was softened, minimized, or left at the margins. The chaos of slaughter was reframed as dramatic conflict between honorable opponents. Reality was not simply forgotten, it was replaced. Honor, once a flexible social tool, became something more useful: propaganda. The shogunate needed warriors who fought effectively and obeyed orders, but it also needed them to believe their service had meaning beyond survival. The answer was ideology, loyalty, sacrifice, devotion, principles that had failed so visibly at Dan-no-ura, repackaged as eternal. Warriors were taught codes that praised obedience and romanticized death in service. The distance between these teachings and battlefield reality was enormous, but the gap served the state. It gave violence a moral costume. Stories like the Heike Monogatari circulated within decades, telling the Genpei War as tragedy steeped in nobility, emphasizing karmic consequence and personal heroism while smoothing over the brutal pragmatism that had actually decided outcomes. These narratives were not neutral records, they were myth-making, designed to give the warrior class a role that felt meaningful and to make the past bearable to inherit. They offered a version of events that could be admired without admitting what warriors were increasingly being used for. Over centuries, the myth thickened. By the Edo period, generations into peace, with samurai often serving as administrators rather than battlefield men, romanticization reached its peak. Texts like the Hagakure presented Bushido as ancient and continuous, as if it had always governed samurai behavior. It was historical fiction with a function. It gave a now redundant warrior class identity. It gave the government a language of discipline and order, and it allowed society to avoid a simpler truth. Warriors had survived through pragmatism far more often than through principle. Dan-no-ura became a foundational trauma Japan did not fully process. The battle revealed what power actually was, how conditional loyalty could become, how expendable even sacred institutions were when survival tightened into a corner. Instead of integrating those truths, society chose repression and narrative. The lessons were applied in practice while denied in story. A permanent split formed: what Japan said about warriors and what it used warriors to do. That choice carried consequences. Warriors were raised on heroic ideals while deployed as pragmatic instruments of state power. The contradiction was managed through ritual, performance, and constant reinforcement of a fiction everyone quietly understood was not fully true. Samurai learned to perform honor while practicing ruthlessness, to speak of loyalty while weighing advantage, to romanticize death while doing everything possible to live. The system held because enough people agreed to maintain the facade. Japan chose survival over truth, effective governance over moral consistency. That choice was not purely cynical. The shogunate did provide stability, and the warrior class did develop genuine codes of conduct. But the cost was enduring. A culture shaped by distance between public ideal and private reality, between what was praised and what was practiced, between legend and blood. The men who survived Dan-no-ura and built the new order understood what they had made. They had watched romantic ideals drown, and they constructed a system based on power rather than principle. Their descendants, raised on polished memory instead of lived experience, would inherit the myth and be shocked when reality contradicted it. The cycle would repeat, ideals shattered by war, myths built to cover the fracture, new generations believing the myth until the world breaks it again. By the time Edo scholars wrote of Bushido as though it had always existed, Dan-no-ura had been transformed from revelation into legend. The child emperor drowning in ceremonial robes became a poetic symbol rather than a horror. Betrayal and pragmatic violence became evidence of moral failure, as if later eras had corrected what the past had lost. The truth was inverted. The code created after Dan-no-ura was presented as having existed before it. The Japan that rose after Dan-no-ura learned to survive by forgetting what survival had required, and that forgetting, deliberate, strategic, and enduring, would shape warrior culture for the next 7 centuries. Dan-no-ura wasn't just the end of a war. It was the end of a comfortable lie. Honor didn't win. Heroism didn't save anyone. Modern Japan was born when its warriors understood that to rule, they needed to abandon the ideal and accept reality. If the Genpei War explained how feudal Japan was born, Dan-no-ura explains what it had to kill to exist. Subscribe to Fragments of History and comment, do you think honor survives in times of war?